Hello, welcome to video 20, where we explore how the government might step into markets where there is market failure through externalities and correct the market failure, or attempt to correct the market failure in those markets. So, video 20, correcting market failure that is caused by externalities. So, let's start with positive externalities. Markets such as healthcare or education, which if left to the market mechanism would see market failure because there'd be an under provision of these goods below what is good for society. It's an under allocation of resources. One way the government might try and resolve that is through the use of subsidies. Now, what I have here is the diagram that shows that the market fails because the market underproduces. You know, we've covered this in a previous video, but the market will produce where marginal private costs and marginal private benefits intersect, and that's here. But if we look at what's best for society, where the marginal social costs and marginal social benefits intersect, that is at a higher level of output. And the market failure is occurring, of course, because the external benefits, the positive externalities that would accrue from this market are not being taken into account by the buyers and sellers in the market. Well, one way to correct this, and of course there is a welfare gain to be experienced here. Here is the welfare gain. Now, if the market is corrected. Now, one way to correct this is through subsidies. If subsidies are given by the government, it reduces the private costs that the buyers and sellers will have to pay. So we can redraw this. Marginal private cost plus subsidy. It's a lower marginal private cost at every level of output. And now, it doesn't change the way that the buyers and sellers think. They still only think about their private costs and their private benefits. But that private cost and private benefits now intersect here. And so we have a higher level of output. Let's call it Q3, the new market level of output. Now, it's not at the socially optimal level yet because the subsidy wasn't big enough. But it's an improvement. The new market generated level of output is closer to the socially optimal level, and the size of the welfare gain remaining to be earned is being reduced, so that the externality has been reduced by that much, and now the new market welfare gain is there. So that's a step. Of course, a bigger subsidy would take the output closer and closer to the socially optimal level. So remember that the subsidy lowers the marginal private cost and taking the output closer to the socially optimal level. That's how positive externalities, markets where there is market failure, might be resolved through the giving of a subsidy by the government. Let's turn now, though, to negative externality markets, and I'm going to identify 4 solutions to correct negative externalities. 4 solutions, 4 ways the government can react and try and correct the market failure. Regulation, tax, extension of property rights, and tradable pollution permits. Regulation is the odd one out. It's the only one where the market forces are not utilised. The market forces are completely overridden with regulation. Let's turn to regulation. We'll go through these in order, but let's take the first one. Regulation, a non-market solution. It's not based upon market forces. What do we know? The government intervenes and overrides the market forces. It places a limit or a ban on the production of a good. Bans on guns, strict limitation on explosives, extremely violent or offensive images in the media, sale of drugs. These markets are deemed to be so negative externality generating that the government steps in and says, you know what, it's not about market forces. We ban or we severely limit, we set regulations on the freedom of these goods and services because it's just not good enough for society. We step in, we set the limit. Examples are, as well as these examples, we could talk about the limit on the age of smoking, or the limit on the age in which people can drive. Would it be examples of regulation, the government stepping in and saying, you know, if you're 14 years old, you're just not allowed to drive. That's it. That's the law. It's not about market forces. Or saying you have to be this age to buy tobacco or alcohol, and so on. That's an example of regulation, stepping in for the good of society in order to correct the market failure that would exist if those goods were available just through a demand and supply and the market mechanism. That's regulation. Now let's get to the three market-based solutions, and I'll step out of the way so you can see it. Taxes, a market-based solution. It uses market forces. The government imposes a tax on a good in order to raise its price and so reduce the quantity bought and sold. The tax acts as a rise in the private costs. Buyers and sellers are still free to act. The way they make decisions has not changed, just the decision they make. So we're not trying to change the way people think. This method of resolving market failure through negative externalities, this is simply utilizing the market forces, and by driving the price of the good upwards with the tax, we can be sure that fewer of these goods will be bought and sold. Quantity demanded falls as price rises, as you know. So by putting up the price, we're not changing the way that buyers and sellers think. They still equate their private costs and private benefits. We just know that less will be bought and sold, which is good for society, because the price has risen. You can show this on a diagram. So let's create a diagram to show the impact of a tax on a good that creates negative externalities. Well, as you know, we start all externality diagrams in the following way. Marginal private benefit, marginal private cost. There is the Q1, that's the market-generated level of output. And if it's a good that creates negative externalities, I'm going to add to the costs. There's marginal social costs. We'll say there's no other benefits to be had. So marginal social benefits is the same as marginal private benefits, but there are external costs, showing us that the socially optimal level, Q2, which is the socially optimal level, is higher than the, is lower than the market-generated level of output. The market is creating too many of these goods. And there is a welfare loss of that area there, welfare loss. Okay, so a tax will raise the private costs. So let me put this in another colour. The tax will raise, let's say that a tax is imposed, and now the marginal private cost plus tax is there, and now buyers and sellers still think in the same way, but now when they equate private costs with private benefits, they're looking at these private costs. There's the intersection between private costs and private benefits. That is the new level of output, and of course the welfare loss has been reduced to this area, and that's a benefit. That's improved. It's taken the market-generated level of output closer to the socially optimal level of output, and that's definitely an improvement. And I can show you a cleaned up version of this diagram here. So this is the same diagram, but it's a much smarter one. If you want to freeze the video now, you can, and you'll see you can learn that the market originally produced here, but the socially optimal was back here, but the imposition of the tax reduced the level of output closer to the socially optimal level, and it reduced the area of welfare loss, which is here, and had been here. Okay, that's tax. Now, these taxes can be evaluated, their effectiveness can be evaluated. So here I've tried to show a few reasons why they can be effective, but also some of the problems that such taxes may have. So taxes are effective because they allow the buyers and sellers to decide. That's the key point. It's a market-based solution. The government is not imposing. It's still up to the individual if they wish to buy or not buy the product in question, and that's seen to be a good thing because it's still about demand and supply. It's just that now there's a tax that's driven up the price. Secondly, they raise revenue for the government. Taxes actually is a secondary benefit. Apart from reducing the quantity of the good being bought and sold, they actually raise revenue for the government. Maybe the revenue could be put towards resolving the problems created by the negative externalities that still remain. Thirdly, they're flexible. The tax can be raised or lowered. One example of why that's useful is in some countries, as the oil price sharply rises, which causes a rise in gas or petrol prices for cars, it's going to be very damaging for the economy. So the government is able to counteract that by lowering their indirect tax, which they already impose on petrol, in order to negate, to some extent, the impact of the rise in the oil prices. So the flexibility of this tax, which can be raised or lowered, is a benefit. It makes government more effective. However, they have drawbacks. Of course, taxes are less effective on goods with low PED. So unfortunately, indirect taxes on cigarettes, indirect taxes on alcohol, on petrol, may not actually reduce the quantity demanded very much. It might raise a lot of revenue for government because consumers continue to buy the good. It takes a significant rise in the price to reduce the quantity demanded much at all, if the good has inelastic demand. And of course, goods like alcohol and tobacco, which are addictive, probably do have inelastic demand, so they may not be very effective, and it may encourage smuggling. Tobacco products are very light, they're very durable, they don't go off, they don't go rotten, they're small, and that makes them ideal for smuggling. Now, as cigarette tax rises, the motivation to smuggle cigarettes into a country to avoid the tax increases, and it has been estimated that 1 out of every 3 packets of cigarettes consumed in the UK, 1 out of every 3 was obtained without paying tax. Perhaps it was brought in from another country and sold, or perhaps even the smoker brought it in from another country and avoided the tax. So there is that danger as well. That's more the case with tobacco rather than other kinds of products. And here's a debate to think about. Some people say that these taxes are unfair because they squeeze low income more than high income earners. You know, if a tax on petrol is put there to reduce the consumption of petrol, it's unfair, it's argued, because that's tougher on the low-income earners who are at the margin and they find it difficult to meet the expense of running a car more than high-income earners. So it's not fair, it doesn't hit everybody equally. But you know, there's a counter-argument to that, to say that just because you find it difficult to afford a good doesn't mean it's acceptable for you to create external costs. Or to put it more bluntly, just because you're poor doesn't mean you get away with polluting. And so I would argue that this is not a fair argument. If you cannot cover all the costs that you create when you consume a good, you shouldn't consume the good. That's a counter-argument to this debate. Okay, let's move on from taxes to our second way of, to our second resolution of negative externalities, and that's the extension of property rights. It's again a market-based solution. This internalizes the external costs. It transforms external costs into being private costs. So internalizing the external cost means turning the costs that were external into being private. And on a diagram, this shifts the MPC curve outwards towards the MSC, reducing the gap, the externalities between the two curves. So if some of the external costs, which are not being picked up by the buyers and the sellers, can be redefined as private costs, then they will have to be paid by the buyer and the seller. And that means there's less external costs, less externalities. And on the diagram it does shift the MPC out towards the MSC. So the market level of output comes back towards the socially optimal level of output. This extension of property rights, it's called this because it extends the rights that people have to the property that is being damaged by the externality. If the air above my head is my property, and it's being damaged by a polluter, the polluter doesn't care. But if I can make the polluter, if I can show that the air is my property and they're damaging something that is my property, then all the rights of property, that is the foundations of our legal system, come into play, and the polluter will have to compensate me or stop polluting me. Just as they would have to compensate me and stop polluting me if they were destroying my house, and I could show that they were destroying my house because my house is protected by property rights. Now, some things in society don't have property rights attached to them. Perhaps lakes, rivers, oceans, forests, the atmosphere. These things don't are not protected by property rights. But if somehow perhaps these things could be extended and have property right protection, legal protection, then the polluters, the damagers of those things, are going to have to pay up or stop damaging them, just as they would if they were damaging something more obviously the property of an individual, like a house or a car. So it can be effective when the pollution is local, such as noise pollution from a new airport, but it will be ineffective very often. It's not a very commonly used one. It can be ineffective as it can be difficult to identify the externality source and place a value on the externality. You see, if there's any doubt about who is the polluter, this system breaks down. So it has to be a very localized polluter, and it has to be able to be demonstrated that that organization, that business was the polluter, so that they will have to pick up the bill for the damage that they are doing. And a good example is smokers suing tobacco giants. If you have an illness caused by smoking, you may be able to take a tobacco giant to court and claim that their product damaged your health. But the only smokers that have been successful in this claim are smokers that started smoking before the packaging was expressing the health dangers of smoking, and also those that can show that they never smoked any other brand of cigarette and they never were in an environment where they were exposed to atmosphere and air that contained pollutants which could have caused the damage that they are experiencing. In other words, it falls upon that smoker to show that the damage, the external cost, must have come from this particular brand of cigarettes, and not from asbestos, or not from a coal mine, or not from another brand of cigarettes. They have to be able to prove beyond all doubt that that this was the polluter before they can get any recompense. And of course, that's difficult to do. So the difficulty of this method of correcting negative externalities, the extension of property rights, often comes in the showing who precisely was the polluter. Of course, very often pollution may come from other, from other areas, or other atmospheric pollution knows no national boundaries. So atmospheric pollution is a very difficult one to pin down. That's why sometimes it's one of the ways this method is used is with correcting noise pollution, where there is no doubt where the noise is coming from. But even then, how do you place a value on the externality? There might be 3 houses in a row, and each of these houses may have a different consideration about the problem of pollution from an airport, noise pollution from an airport. The first household might hate it and it keeps them awake all night. The second household might quite like the noise, and it might be a different number of people in the household being disturbed. And in the third household, maybe there's just an old man who's hard of hearing and doesn't even hear the aeroplanes. So how can you place a value on such an externality? That's very difficult to do as well. Okay, let's move on to pollution permits. Pollution permits is the final way of correcting negative externalities that we're going to look at. It's widely used, and it's a market-based solution. Once again, it's up to the buyers and the sellers to decide whether they continue or don't continue. Here's how the system works. The government identifies an acceptable level of pollution in a particular industry and allocates pollution permits up to that level. Firms are then free to buy and sell these permits amongst themselves. So the government allocates a fixed level of pollution permits to pollute, the right to pollute, and they distribute them in the industry. But then the industry can buy and sell them. And of course the incentive is that the cleaner you are as a business in that industry, the fewer permits you require, plus you may have spare permits which you can sell to other firms that need permits. So consequently, there is a financial incentive, and that's the point, because of course these buyers and sellers are considering it on a financial level. They're not considering external costs and benefits. They're only thinking about their private costs and private benefits. So this gives the industry, the players in the industry, the businesses, a financial incentive to get clean. and not just a social incentive. It's not just corporate social responsibility now. It's actually a genuine financial, profit-driven reason to get clean. And it's an effective system, as government will achieve its pollution target, assuming that all the firms in the industry will only pollute up to the level of permits that they possess. Secondly, individual firms take financial decision whether to get clean or buy permits. That's up to them, and only they know what's best for them. The government is not imposing limits on every firm. It's saying there's a limit on the industry. You can decide whether you want to be the clean or the dirty firm, and you can decide what level of permits you buy. And the price of a permit is in that newly created market for permits. Thirdly, clean firms have an incentive to get even cleaner. They can sell any excess permits that they possess. This is an extremely important point, because if the government simply gave every firm a pollution limit, firms meeting that limit would have no incentive to get even cleaner. But now they do have that incentive. Every time they get cleaner, they have spare permits which they can sell and earn revenue from. And fourthly, flexible system. It's a flexible system as governments can change the quantity of permits over time. So the government can issue permits for 2 years, and then in the next 2 year cycle, they may issue 5% fewer permits. This is getting the industry cleaner over time. But these are the reasons why it's an effective system, but it can be ineffective as well. The government needs to police the emissions. It needs to check the emissions, and that's expensive, and there may be corruption, and it might be difficult to measure and assess whether the firms are keeping to their limits. Secondly, the number of permits may be set so high that their price collapses. Of course, the effectiveness of the system very much depends upon whether the number of permits is realistic. If they flood the market with permits, the permits will have no value, and firms will simply buy up lots of permits. It will be very unlikely that it will be cost effective to simply get cleaner. They'll just buy the permits. So setting the right number of permits for this to work is a difficulty. Thirdly, permit hoarding can occur, often by new third-party firms. So this new firms, new businesses set up in this market, existing simply to buy and hoard the permits, hoping their value will go up. So there can be distortions like this in the market. Fourthly, the pollution is often from abroad. This is often, if we're talking about atmospheric pollution, well, atmospheric pollution knows no boundaries. So the efforts of one country operating a system such as this may have little international or global impact because of the pollution from other countries. And of course, it reduces the competitiveness of firms globally as their costs rise, because it will drive up their costs. Firms will have to either buy permits or get cleaner, and if other countries are not following a similar system, then they will have a cost advantage. So that it can reduce the competitiveness of an industry in the global market, and that can cause macroeconomic problems like unemployment. So these are reasons why the system may not be effective. Okay, and finally, this system of permits or tradable obligations has many applications. Just some examples: the Kyoto Protocol, which many countries signed up to regarding carbon emissions. Countries were able, if they met and went below their limit, they were able to sell carbon emission pollution permits to other countries. Or carbon trading emission schemes in Europe, and for instance recently in Australia one of these was created. Or milk quotas. It's a similar idea that in the EU farmers were given milk quotas, but there was an ability for farmers to buy and sell the quantities of milk that they were permitted to produce. Even the Russian army, I'm told, and I might be wrong, but I'm told that of course in some countries there's conscription. Children, boys, have to go in the army for a certain amount of time. Here in Greece that's the case. Young men have to go in the army for about 9 months, I think. Now in Russia, and there's no getting out of it, now in Russia I'm told that you have an obligation to go in the army, but if you find someone else who'll do that obligation for you, you're entitled to pay that person an amount of money that is agreed between the two, and the other person does your army obligation. And now this is a similar system, of course, because it's as if the army is saying, look, we want this many soldiers, but we don't really mind if you come or if you pay that person to come. That's up to you. And if you think it's worth it, if they think it's worth it, you can buy and sell between yourselves as long as we get one more body in the army. So in a sense, this tradable obligation is very similar to pollution permits. It's saying it's up to you. You know best what's best for you. Just provide us with one more person in the army. Instead of saying, this person might be a brilliant student, a brilliant physicist, a brilliant medical person, or a brilliant dental surgeon or something, but no, you've got to come along here and march up and down, and that's, that would be a bad use, a bad allocation of resources. Better that person stays out of the army and bring in someone else who is prepared to go in the army and doesn't have much else to offer, let's say. So, anyway, I've waffled on, but here's a final thought. A final thought, solving traffic problems in London and in Athens. Two big cities, and of course cities all over the world, are grappling with this problem, how to solve the problem of traffic congestion in city centres. Well, two contrasting methods. In Athens, regulation is used. The first of my solutions to negative externalities, regulation. It's simply like this. Depending on the day of the week, if your car number plate ends, your car registration number plate ends in an odd or an even number, whichever it is, that's the day that you can go into the city centre on the equivalent odd or even day of the calendar. So if it's the 9th of the month, then only 9 being an odd number, only odd numbered car registration plates, only those cars can drive into the centre. The other 50%, all the even numbers, are banned. And so you can only go in every other day. Whereas, of course, in London, there is a congestion charge. You can drive in the centre any day you like, as long as you pay, which is effectively a tax. So here we have two different cities, one adopting regulation as the way of resolving the problem, the other adopting tax. And, I would argue that the second, the market-based solution, tax, is a better solution, because individually, people can individually decide which is the right day for them. If they never want to drive in, they don't drive in. If they want to drive in every day, they can drive in every day. If they really need to go in today, they can pay and go in today. But in Athens, you can't do that. Maybe you really need to go in today, but you've got the wrong number plate. You're allowed to go in tomorrow, but you don't want to go in tomorrow. So the odd-even system, which I'm told exists in Mexico City, for example, as well as Athens, that's been chosen by some countries, it seems to deny the individual wishes of the driver. And it doesn't take into account that there may be days when they need to go in and now they're not able to get into the city centre. The London system is far more flexible, far more adjustable, because they can raise or lower the congestion charge and get just the right amount of traffic. If they set the congestion charge at £1,000 a day, the streets will be empty. If they set the congestion charge at 1 penny per day, the streets will be packed and there'll be no improvement on traffic congestion. There must be a price in between the two which delivers the right level of traffic congestion. But the odd-even number is so arbitrary, it's 50%, 50%. I mean, how do we know if that delivers exactly the right level of traffic? We don't. So I would argue that the market-based solutions always trump or beat the regulation methods. But that's just a normative statement, and you can debate that with me and disagree with me, and that's fine as well. Okay, so I hope that long video gave you an idea about how governments can attack the problems of negative and positive externalities when they occur as market failure in markets. Okay, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.